Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who has taken the time to join us for this really important must-have conversation. And I am deeply honored to be joined today by Dr. Clem McCartney. Clem is an independent research consultant from Northern Ireland, and the Honorable Martin Kobler. He is a former career diplomat. And ladies and gentlemen, the discussion today is going to be focusing on the importance and the need to transform conflict for sustainable peace. And the theme is enhancing humanitarian action and peace building. Without any further ado, I am going to kindly ask Dr. McCartney to please introduce himself. And I would also ask you if you could please introduce the important element that you would like this discussion to focus on. You have the word.
Thank you, Jan Hans, and thank you everyone for coming. And it's a pleasure to be invited to join UNITAR for this session. Jan Hans has already said I'm an independent consultant. I've never been a diplomat, but I've spent quite a lot of my time working with diplomats. I started off studying law. I then worked in social development, and I avoided conflict as much as I could. And living in a conflicted society of Northern Ireland, that wasn't so easy. But I always felt this wasn't the real issue. The existential identity question wasn't the real issue. But then I worked overseas, and when I worked overseas, I found conflicts, repeat patterns of dynamics from one place to another, and that the actual identity question is quite central. So, having finished that work, I then became involved full time in conflict resolution, working first in a university and then as an independent consultant, and have done that for many years until about the 2007, when I moved into more peace building and conflict resolution type work. And I was involved with the Club of Madrid and developed there a concept of peace building, which we call building a shared society, which perhaps will come into the discussion presently. I think the big issue for me in all of this is the holistic nature of these situations that we're working in, that there's so many dimensions of it and so many actors. It's awfully easy to try to say, let's deal with one bit and then we'll worry about the other bits later. It doesn't work. We have to look at how we can deal with all the different dimensions and all the different players at the same time. Not easy, but necessary, I think. So I hand from there over to Martin.
Martin, you are mute. Could you please unmute yourself?
Yes, unmuted. So thank you very much, Clem. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us here, Jan Hans, and all the viewers, wherever you come from. I'm Martin Kobler, and I'm a hybrid kind of version of German bilateral diplomatic service. I was ambassador in Cairo, in Baghdad, and in Pakistan at the end of my career. But the last third of my career, I spent with the United Nations. And this is a matter very close to my heart. I was deputy SRSG in Afghanistan. I was then in Baghdad also as SRSG, and at MONUSCO, leading and heading the biggest peacekeeping mission of 20,000 soldiers at that time, and then also SRSG in Libya. So I'm looking back to two areas, the bilateral one, and I compare it to the multilateral one. And here comes my concerns, because I see a weakening of the multilateral system due to many ideas we are going to discuss, many reasons we are going to discuss, but this is something which concerns me very much, the erosion of the international order and the weakening of the multilateral system. And with this, over to you, Jan Hans.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCarthy and the Honorable Martin Kobler. I also would just like to recognize some of our participants who have joined us. We have participants from Hungary, we have participants from Islamabad, from Switzerland. A warm welcome to Professor Terry Savage. We have colleagues from Nigeria joining, Venezuela and Mexico, from Brazil, again from Hungary, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Philippines, to all of you, East Timor, India, from South Africa, and we also have the colleagues from the Atlantic Center. Ladies and gentlemen, you are all very, very welcome. So to jump straight into the question, if I may, the theme that was raised by Dr. McCarthy, and that is the necessary to create these shared responsibilities and the participation of the different actors. And if I may first ask you, Dr. McCarthy, to expand a little bit on that, and then I would again ask Martin to please build on that, specifically within terms of the multilateral system. Why do you think there are these failures, and what do you both believe can be done, for instance, by institutions such as Diplomats Without Borders and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research? And I'm going to also say the Atlantic Center, because, ladies and gentlemen, I kindly invite you to look up the information and the honorable mission of the Atlantic Center within the domain of the blue economy and maritime security. Dr. McCarthy, you have the word.
Thank you. When I first got involved in conflict resolution, and we're talking about 1980 or thereabouts, there was a transition had been happening from the traditional bargaining that went on between states, competitive rivalry between leaders, and everybody sat and watched was suffered from their conflicts and their fighting and the killing and so on that was going on. And there was the growing awareness that it was a societal issue and it needed to be dealt with in a societal way. And I'm thinking of the times when Johan Galtung became prominent with the kind of arguments that he was making. John Burton from Australia also, and there was a number of different schools of thought, Herb Kessler-Kuhlman in the United States and so on. But there was a ferment of ideas about conflict resolution, and the term appeared at that point, conflict resolution, as the way in which conflicts could be addressed. And it was about involving all the parties to think about what all their interests were, thinking about how all their interests could be met. And as a result, you would then get a solution which satisfied everybody and therefore was sustainable and durable. And even the people who had no voice could be included in that. Their needs could be taken into account and a needs-based approach developed. And I think the other thing that happened at that stage was that in the Cold War, there was a feeling that we hadn't found a decent, sensible way to deal with conflicts. And there was therefore in political leadership in many, but not all countries, there was an openness to try to be involved in these kind of discussions. And maybe some of the people who were prominent at that stage were good salesmen. And so they were able to promote their ideas and be invited into discussions about how conflict should be dealt with. I understand that at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, the US had learned a lesson from past failures and invited folks in who were involved in the ideas that I'm just discussing to be part of their exploration of what their strategy should be. And that therefore was, if you like, developed into the high point of trying to resolve conflicts through negotiation, through diplomacy, and through involving a whole range of parties and interests. And it's interesting, actually, that competitive rivalry between leaders is hard to resolve because one wins, one loses. There is no win-win solution there, except some kind of fix. But when you come to think about the needs of all the parties, you discover that, in fact, there is a way to do that. The only problem with this approach is that it's slow and it takes time. And so as time has gone on, I think people have begun to resile from that kind of position. They still use the language and the rhetoric which developed of conflict resolution, conflict transformation. But in fact, they then try to find a way of saying, we would do that if we had time, if we could, but in the short term, we have to get a quick fix. And we come into ideas such as elite bargaining. You know, we will bargain between the political leaders, the generals fighting the war, and then once they've stopped fighting, then we can talk about the other issues. And that almost never works because the real needs are not being addressed. And the problem festers and re-emerges quite soon afterwards. So we're in a bit of a fix at the moment in that we've seen a different way to do things, and we still say we're doing them in this kind of much more principled way. But in fact, very often we are not, and we don't perhaps always recognize our failure. And if I can just mention here the SDGs, I mean, they're really founded in this idea of meeting needs, addressing the different interests of people and doing it in a holistic way and so on. But in fact, it's struggling to be implemented. You know, we've got the rhetoric in the Agenda 2030, but we're struggling to actually put the resources and the effort in to make it happen. So I think we're back now in a situation where, as you said, Jan-Hans, we need to be thinking, how can Diplomats Without Borders, UNITAR, and other organizations reawaken the idea that we need to work in this way? And that's where the multilateralism question comes in. So I'll hand over to you, Martin, and then I may or may not want to add to what you say.
Okay, thank you. So it's very interesting to hear Clem, because he's a real practitioner here, but coming from a different perspective than myself. I'm more a political practitioner, being at embassies or in missions. And if I look back on my missions, I started as a young man to open the German office in Jericho with the Palestinian Authority way back in '94. At the beginning of Oslo, and then later on Afghanistan, Iraq, Congo, where MONUSCO has to leave right now. Happy to have a participant from the Congo also, and later in Libya. So these were all failures. Now, looking back to the professional life here, where we struggled for bringing about a solution for the people, and seeing this going up in flames, be it Gaza now, be it Afghanistan, which was a failure, Iraq, well, we will see. Of course, I put myself the question, what went wrong? And this is something we have to discuss in order to learn better for the future. Now, I think the erosion of the international system, the erosion of what we believe in, the lack of a consensus of our global values, I think this is one of the main reasons. But why? The longer I worked in this field and the more failures I have, and I was happy to join the United Nations because the UN can fail. Yeah, so we have to do our best, but we can afford to fail. A Secretary General of the UN can fail. A German chancellor or a prime minister cannot fail because they have a local constituency here. But then, if you fall down, you get up, you try again. Now, and this was the charm of the UN. But anyhow, it did not work. So why? I think the longer I was in the business, I felt that there is always, and this is what Clem also hinted at, there is always these quick fixes. Yeah, which have to be done. You always, if you go into a mediation process, you say, well, how can participants go back with a quick fix to their constituency? Listen, I was successful in a way. However, we never really address the root causes. And the main root cause, I think, is the lack of cohesion, of a lack of social contract in societies. So if we speak about the erosion of the international order, primarily, I do not hint at the UN or China or the global kind of picture. I point my fingers to those who are living in the countries and who are suffering this process. There's no social cohesion. And we are unable, as UN, as international community, to go to these root causes here. Let me give you an example. Libya is a fine example where you see it's not a big problem. 6 million people, oil richest country in Africa, so nobody should be poor, but a lot of conflicts. And when I was there in 2013 to 2015, we were not able to bring the country together. Now, of course, the international community plays a role, but the main reason is the lack of social cohesion, the lack of the Libyans and others to say, where do we want to go with our country? What is our value system? How also do we want to distribute power and money? And we never were able to address these problems. We just said, well, fighting has to stop and ceasefire and exchange of prisoners and have a constitution and have elections and these kind of things in our peace plans. But how to bring about a social contract, according to Rousseau, who said, I mean, if you live in a certain area, you have to have a social contract. You have to agree with all differences of opinion, but you have to agree in principle in a state about distribution of power and money. And we never came to this point in none of the crises, how to promote this social cohesion. And that's why I think we have this, among many other double standard questions and geostrategic consideration. It starts with the individual. It starts with the individual Congolese, German, Pakistani, Indian, or whoever, to bring about the social cohesion in the state, and then building on this to solve the conflict. So far here.
Thank you so much to both of you, Dr. McCarthy and the Honourable Martin Kobler. Ladies and gentlemen who have connected, please feel free to post questions, and we would gladly, when we come in about 15 minutes to the question and answer session, we'd be very happy to draw on your questions. So if I may try to summarize what you've all have said so far, is that the pursuit of sustainable peace in conflict-affected regions is one of the most crucial challenges facing our world today. And as we gather to discuss the theme, transforming conflict and sustainable peace, enhancing humanitarian action and peace building, we must recognize that the topic is not just an academic exercise, but in fact, a matter of life and death for millions around the globe. Conflict transformation goes beyond ending violence. As Dr. McCarthy was saying, it involves addressing the root causes, healing communities, and building resilient societies. To quote you, the Honourable Martin Kobler, to build societies, resilient societies that can withstand future challenges that are being brought on by the economic predatory of the natural resource industry, and also the non-respect and the non-development of the Sustainable Development Goals, as was alluded to earlier. So by enhancing our approaches to humanitarian action and peace building, we have the opportunity to break these cycles of violence and to create lasting positive change. And this is where I would like to ask, and I allude back to the Honourable Martin Kobler. How do you think, in training of young diplomats today, we can embed this to move away from the traditional idea of the state has the absolute power based on the Westphalian notion of statehood, etc., etc. Because if we look at the members of the United Nations today, it is a vast difference in the agendas, the needs, the wants. So how do we train young diplomats today to be sensitive to this idea of conflict and peace for sustainable development? And the same question to Dr. McCarthy, but in terms of how peace studies are framed within institutions of higher education, how do we bring it up to date so that it is cognizant of the modern times, the need to have co-ownership of the different elements that represents a nation state and a society, but also the reality of artificial intelligence today? The Honorable Martin Kobler.
Thanks, Jon Hans. That's very interesting because you see, we are very often speaking about Security Council Resolution 1325. This is women, peace, and security. In my activities in the UN, I equally emphasized the sister resolution, which is youth, peace, and security. I forgot the number, so maybe this is telling. I think, you see, this has to be coincide. It has to coincide that we really take care of the young people also through training measures. Now, to give you an example, what I did in the Libya context, I was always a little bit not angry, but astonished that the pen holders of a Security Council resolution, a peacekeeping mission like Libya or the Congo, these are always Western powers. Yeah. So I said to myself, why does the UK, for example, have to be the pen holder of the Libya resolution? Why not at least a shared pen holdership with the Libyans? And then I met the young people. We are training nowadays in Tripoli. And I told them, listen, I will be at the Security Council presenting the case of UNSMIL. And please draft from your perspective, draft your ideal Security Council mandate for Libya. And I went to the Security Council then with this resolution, and I told member states, listen, thank you very much. It was very nice, UK, for extending the mandate. However, here I have a slightly different perspective. It is very important to address the young people by training measures, and Diplomats Without Borders is focusing in one of its pillars on training, as we do it now for here with UNITAR, but also bilateral academies to tell them from our experience the stories. We cannot change the world anymore. It's you, young people, young men and women, who have to do it. So just to tell them, listen, if populism and nationalism, if the world is going this way and further eroding the international order, it's up to you to fight against it. Now, and to develop a kind of consciousness of the young diplomats and young people here that the international order, and sometimes put the national interest in second rank and see, be it climate, be it disarmament and the like, that it's good for the whole world to put national interests behind. So these kind of training measures are absolutely necessary all over the world for young diplomats, and we from Diplomats Without Borders, we are very happy to transmit our experience and to tell our stories, what worked and what did not work. Now, I am a convinced multilateralist. So multilateralist, I mean, this is sometimes a little bit unrealistic or so, but just to have an insight that only multilateralism can bridge the gaps. Now, I'm coming from a European country, and we had 3 terrible wars with France, for example. After the war, the European Union was pro forma an economic union, but what was it politically? It was politically a means to restrain and to control Germany and Italy, the aggressors of the Second World War, in order to put them in a cage, so to say. Yeah. Now, and this preserved our peace and stability, and of course also our prosperity in Europe until these days. That's why if we see these populist tendencies right now, this is something, a way we should not go, and this is very, very important message. Now, coming briefly back, and then I stop to the German-French example. I was, as a young diplomat, posted in India. So I have seen the Indians and their view towards the Pakistanis and the Kashmir conflict and so on. And I finished my career as an ambassador to Pakistan, so also knowing the other side. This was something which was quite interesting, and to see that this frozen conflict in Kashmir, that it was not solved by neither side. But when I was at the UN, I was in the Security Council, briefing the Security Council, and these were times where both the Pakistanis and the Indians were member of the Security Council. But with the current system, we don't have to speak here about the reform of the UN. In the current system, they did not table their own conflict in the Security Council because they were afraid. And I always went to, in Pakistan then with a French colleague, to TV shows and so, and presented to them our joint French-German history book with millions of people dying in the wars, in 3 terrible wars. And where are we 60, 70 years later after the Second World War? We developed a joint book. The French are teaching in French, the same text, the same line, the same reading of history, and the Germans in German. And with this book, both the German and French ambassador, we went to the TV shows that it is possible. Don't lose hope. That's my main message. So even Indians and Pakistanis might not talk to each other, and many, many others also. Once you start talking, you might end up, imagine Pakistanis and Indians, just as an example. You have in a few years from now a joint history book over the most terrible periods also, interpreting the most terrible periods of your joint history as it was done between the Germans and the French. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. McCarthy?
Yeah, I think that in a way the problem is not the development of young diplomats or the training of conflict resolution people, because I think we kind of talk about that in maybe a more theoretical way. I don't mean an academic way, but we talk about an ideal world. Yeah, let me put it that way. We talk about an ideal world. The problem is that when we come to do these things in practice, we are culturalized into a much more competitive, polarized system. So that gradually we begin to say, yeah, we have to be aggressive, we have to be belligerent, we can dress it up with nice language, but basically we don't give any ground to the other people. And at one point, Martin mentioned the word fear. You know, the fear becomes a very important part of it. If we give ground to the other, we've got an expression, give a man your hand and he takes your arm. You know? So the idea of being nice to other people begins to be expressed with a lot more caution. And so we know, in a sense, what we would like to be like. We know what we would like to have, but we're very nervous about really doing the things which are needed to make it happen. And some of that is selfishness, and some of it is competitiveness, but some of it is also just not certain of how to make this work and how to make this happen. And so we have a system, the current global system. One of our speakers is one of our people in the chat has talked about why are we disregarding international humanitarian law. We have all these systems, but we believe that the other parties are using them for their advantage against us. And so we don't have a real willingness to come to comply with the rules because we don't think our opponents are complying with the rules. It's the kind of way that individual nation states were internally within their own societies not so very long ago. People didn't want to accept the authority of the state, the authority of government, the authority of the justice system, because they felt that it worked against them. And so we have this situation now where, we have the group whose title I can't quite remember, but it's Defenders of the UN Charter. And I'm thinking of the group which involves North Korea, Iran, Russia, and so on and so forth. Many states which look or are claimed, are challenged for not complying with the very rules that they're saying they're defending, because they see the other side bending the rules, twisting the rules, taking advantage of opportunities. And we end up using our legal knowledge and our casuistry, and we end up using our rational capacities to justify ourselves at the expense of the other. And we see that working out now in the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza. And so it's very, very difficult to find a way in which we can say there is a central arbiter which will help us to define what exactly you do in this situation according to humanitarian law and apply it. So I think we need to find ways in which we encourage and develop opportunities to stand back and get out of the gridlock that we've got ourselves in. And I think lots of people do know this and try to do it, but are often persuaded by circumstances to pull back from it. We in DWB are very fortunate because our members have been there, have had to try and struggle with this kind of dilemma in their work. And they're now in a situation where they're released from that gridlock and they can be much more able to both understand what's going on and also try to help to find ways to move forward from it. So I think the problem is that it's not the people who are flagrantly disregarding international humanitarian law, as the question said, actually believe that the other side is also flagrantly disregarding it. And we need to find a way of getting the kind of debates, discussions that are needed. And that means that the people are together in the one room, the good old-fashioned diplomatic method of discussion, where you listen to the other side and you hear what the other side thinks is happening, and you challenge them and they challenge you, and then you begin to find a way in which you understand each other and you understand the need to work together, which is exactly what happened after the war between France and Germany, what Martin was already describing to us. People heard the other person's point of view, compared it to their own point of view, were challenged and responded to those challenges.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your very rich contribution to up to now in our webinar. I'm going to, because Dr. McCartney basically answered the question that was asked about the by one of the participants, Professor Savage, about the failure of respecting and to enforce IHL. If I may ask the Honourable Martin Kobler, we have a question about North Cyprus, and the first question is the frozen conflict has a big impact on foreigners, and if they can be, how can Diplomats Without Border, is there a way in which it can play a role to try and find a solution to this situation? And the candidate who asks the question also say that this is the theme of their PhD dissertation, because as an international student, they cannot go to conferences due to the unrecognized political statu quo in which they find themselves in North Cyprus. So getting a visa is a huge challenge for them. Any reflections on that?
Oh, yes, I have a definite opinion on this. Now, I mean, diplomats without borders cannot solve the conflict, number one. Yeah, so others tried and tried for decades now to solve the conflicts. We are an NGO, but we can prepare the ground. Now, training measures to bring Cypriot Turkish and Cypriot Greek students together, or young diplomats together, inside or outside Cyprus. I mean, this might be a way. Now, the biggest challenge is to overcome separation. Wherever you find separation, difficulties to get a visa to the other side. You mentioned this question, the separation of Palestinians and Israelis. I mean, if people do not talk to each other, there will be no consensus. And societies have to talk. People-to-people programs have to be established. And very important, there must be courageous leaderships. Without a leadership which is breaking deadlocks on both sides of the conflict, it will not work. Societies alone cannot do it. We can prepare the ground together with them, but you need other ingredients. A leadership is very important. Coming back to the German-French separation after the war, after 3 wars, by the way, from 1871 and the First and the Second World War, the trauma were very deep. We would never have managed as a society to come together hadn't we had de Gaulle, hadn't we had Adenauer, courageous leaders who then kickstarted the whole process. And also Greek Cyprus, we need the leaders to do it. If you do not have leadership, and if you do not have the consciousness of what I mentioned, a social contract, it will not work. One of the major mistakes because we are now every day watching TV, and I'm just coming back from the Middle East also. The major mistake of the Oslo process was that it was cementing the separation between Israelis and Palestinians. You can do this for security reasons for a certain time, 1 year, 2 years, whatever. But then you have to allow people coming together. Otherwise, the transitional justice process, the forgiveness at the end for the other side will never start. If you separate peoples in political conflicts, be it Kashmir, be it Cyprus, be it Israel-Palestine, it will not work. So leadership, end of separation, young people meet people-to-people programs and courageous leaderships.
Thank you very much, Martin. Clem, if I may ask you, we have a question. How can peace be ensured in a conflict where there are one or more parties who have refused all peace prospects or compromises, or the direct aim to benefit from war?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was saying earlier, if someone, at the present time, very often the approach to that kind of situation is to try to use carrots and sticks, coercion or bribery, if you like. And it's often extremely difficult. And very often there are opposing carrots and sticks being offered by different parties. So we have the people at the center of the conflict, and we also have a number of other parties around them who have got influence, but are using it not necessarily in a way that we might see as being constructive. They actually find it, they're also part of the conflict, and they want it to be resolved in a way which works in their benefit. And so they encourage the conflict to continue. And so it's not going to work with carrots and sticks. And yet it takes time to do anything else. And it's creating the time in which you can build a different kind of approach. And that may involve a lot of work being done with the people who are sponsors of the parties to the conflict, and trying to work out ways in which they can understand that it's not actually in their own interest to continue supporting this conflict, never mind the damage and the distress that it's causing to other people. So we need to find a way, and we do find ways, but they take time, to talk with all of the parties within the conflict and around the conflict to begin to think in different ways about the situation. I use in my work, and we all all the members of Diplomats Without Borders work in different ways. We don't have a set template for how we work. And I would argue we can't have a set template for how we do things, because every situation needs to be responded to within the time scale and the frame of what's happening. But I would often use a future thinking approach, which is actually saying, look forward 20 years' time. Do you really want to be in this situation then? Is there a way in which this situation could be changed, in which you could get what you want without denying the other parties what they want, by building a vibrant society which is receiving the needs, its needs are being met? And so, for example, at the early stages of the situation in South Africa, which was very locked, and the National Party in the 1990s was not very interested in trying to change a different methodology, and they always were hoping something would come up when they could continue in the way that they were going. And my namesake, Clem Sunday, produced a future scenario which said, do you realize what the future will be if you go on the way you're doing? And I know from talking to people who were involved in that they really were forced to think that we will have to find another solution, because if we go on like this, we'll end up in a declining situation, which is worse for us, never mind all the other parties involved in the conflict. So we need to find ways in which people stop and think, and yet we tend rather to reinforce, we continue to raise the stakes, to polarize the situation more, tit for tat, all of these things. That's the instinctive reaction we make. And we don't build the kind of understanding that if we work for peace, if we work in peaceful ways, if we work within the framework of sustainable development, we will in fact begin to see that there is another way out of this conflict, and it's not only by violence. But we tend to sort of always fall back on, we have to have a strong defense posture. We always have to have lots of security. We have to threaten the other side, or we have to coerce them, or even attack the other side. We need to change that whole perspective. And I think there is, certainly not all our members, Martin, but quite a lot of our members would think in terms of having to make that kind of step.
Thank you so much, Clem. Martin.
If I may briefly add to this question, we're always speaking, with whom do we talk? I think it's equally important to think about, with whom do we not talk? Whom do we exclude? Now, I know this is not in the mediation handbooks, because we are talking to everybody. However, do we really have to talk to genociders? Do we really have to talk to parties like in the Sudan to conflict, who are blocking food aid and starve a population? Is it really wise to include them and invite them to Jeddah or Geneva for talks or other places? Or shouldn't we make clearer that we base our cooperation with parties to the conflict on a clear value system, which excludes that we do not negotiate at the end with criminals who should go to The Hague and to the ICC. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood here. In the Congo, of course, we are talking also to those who are indicted by the International Criminal Court. Once out of every 10 of my partners at that time, I mean, of course, they should go to The Hague. But should they be really part of a solution after that? And this I doubt, and we have to think about it, whether we are not a little bit more, shouldn't be a little bit more robust, because the international value system will corrode if we allow that genociders, that war criminals are included in a power sharing agreement at the end of the day and do not go to The Hague.
Thank you so much, Clem and Martin. I would like to rephrase this question, because what I've heard from both of you is that there is a certain level of bias that is embedded in the way that we practice conflict transformation, peace discussions, how do we make sure, and again, I come back to training and development, capacity development, that we ensure 360-degree and that we don't look at the annals of history from a national context, but how do we look towards what Clem was saying, and it was my lived experience in South Africa, growing up and being classified as a person of color, non-white, and how do we then make sure that we look towards what Clem mentioned, the 20-year or the 10-year possibility, so that we make sure we include everybody that needs to be part of that conflict transformation and peace building process. How do we overcome that institutional, cultural, national bias, and dare I say, theoretical bias that may exist as well? Clem.
Yeah, I think we also have to recognize that whatever we do in terms of face-to-face meetings and diplomatic contact, there's also the issue of the dominant discourse in the country that we're dealing with and the dominant discourse within the international community. And I think we're criticizing both of those at the moment. So and that's about the idea that there is a way to solve problems. There is an idea about the things you have to worry about. The idea that force is more effective than anything else. The idea that we need to spend huge quantities of our resources and the world's resources on weapons and the military, and that goes unquestioned, virtually unquestioned. It's a marginal alternative view, and it's not even thought about. So I'm not even saying we have to start making an argument for pacifism. I'm saying we have to get the dominant discourse around how do we get security, and do we get security through the use of weapons? And if we can get a change in that kind of way, if we can get a kind of change in the way which it seems so obvious, I think, to me, and I think to all of us, probably most of the people who are listening to us, that if you have an idea that social development is the way to get people able to engage, that we have participation, that we have agency, we have voice, that we are respected, that we have dignity, if we can begin to get that kind of pattern into the dynamic, into the discourse, then people begin to be open to doing things in a different way. But while most people feel that they're marginal, they go along with this kind of way of thinking. And just to make one comment in that respect, the whole issue about undesirable people who are doing terrible things becomes less central, because you're denying the whole way that everybody works, including them, because their use of violence and use of terrible, horrific actions against other people, including killing people, it becomes seen as, it's a bit like in the national society, the people who will go out and use guns and kill people, are become quickly seen as not part of the normal way of life. But there are societies in our world at the moment where that's accepted as inevitable just because of the way that their thinking goes. Those questions need to be put into the public discourse, not only into the colleges, not only into diplomatic training, but we need to get that aired. And one of the things that in a way I would give credit to the UN for doing is it tries to air these subjects. It tries to get them to question the basic assumptions we're making. And hopefully the Summit of the Futures is doing that, though I don't think Martin either. We have a huge amount of hope that it's going to get there, but it is a forum in which we can begin to not only argue about particular disputes, but we can argue about the whole way we do things. And again, I do think the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 30 was an admirable example of doing that. But then we had the problem that we hadn't got the capacity to keep following it up. The review process doesn't necessarily hold people to account. And so we have slippage. And so people are still left marginal and unsustained. So I think it's a lot about not only what we're talking about now, which is the formal negotiation processes and so on, engagement, but it's also about changing the discourse. And I think going back to South Africa, that changed the discourse, and other things happened there which began to change the discourse. I think Nelson Mandela was very good at changing the discourse, getting people doing a small thing which immediately made the assumptions that people were making questionable. And they had to stop and look at that. So we need to think about doing those kind of things as well as just getting the conflicting parties into the room.
Thank you so much, Clem. And just before I give the word to Martin, of course, we also need to recognize another giant in peaceful resistance is the Honorable Mahatma Gandhi. The legacy that he has left us in terms of peaceful resistance. Martin.
Yes, and now in answer to your question, I think it's important to get parties to agree on a value system first. Yeah, so there needs to be two pillars. One, the agreement on a value system. For example, fighting does not pay. I mean, if you look at the global figures, it's a scandal that the current conflicts cost 20 trillion US dollars now. And the Sustainable Development Goals, and Clem mentioned it, needs 2.4 trillion or until 4 trillion. Now, it's very on the global level, it's very easy that all of us say this is crazy to spend 20 trillion on one side, and for SDGs, we need 4 trillion. So better, I mean, to go into education, into the proper allocation of resources, because military spending is a misallocation of resources, necessary at times, but a misallocation anyhow. Now, this value system to create social cohesion among the principles of the parties around the table. However, it will not work if you don't look back. And South Africa is a fine example of transitional justice, of forgiveness, that those who were tortured have at the end of the day forgive their torturers. Now, and this is a process which has to be everywhere. And it leads, you cannot agree really on a joint value system and a social contract here and joint principles if you don't look back to the past and deal with the trauma you had.
Thank you so much, Martin and Clem. And so many of the questions that we've had today was also basically reflecting on the validity of the UN in dealing with this. To what extent can Diplomats Without Borders truly influence these complex issues? And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to try to answer your question head on. This webinar and the collaborative partnership between the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and Diplomats Without Borders is a clear example of how we are trying to address through a 360-degree lens the complexity of these questions. And we kindly invite you to also consider joining us for some other topics that we're going to be discussing. In September, we will have a webinar leading through complexity, and we're going to address the question of leadership, team, and self-management for the implementation and the delivery of the UN 2030 agenda in conflict settings. In October, we're going to be looking at the gender responsive protection of civilians, and we're going to be looking at the legal framework specific to also integrating community-based strategies. In November, we're going to look at specifically a dedicated webinar looking at humanitarian law and action and leveraging IHL to achieve the UN Agenda 2030 in conflict settings. And then finally, in December, climate change as a threat to global security. And we also wish to invite you. UNITAR will host its second international conference that will be hosted at the UN offices in Brussels during the 3rd and the 4th of December. And my colleague in the chat has posted the link. So for those of you that would be interested, we also kindly invite you. We are still open to receive abstracts for both in-person participation or online participation. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Martin Kobler and Dr. Clem McCartney, allow me to draw our session to conclusion. As we conclude our discussion on transforming conflict for sustainable peace, let us remember that the road ahead is long, but not insurmountable. The challenges we face in humanitarian action and peace building are complex, but so too is the human capacity for resilience, reconciliation, and renewal. And the example between two warring countries, France and Germany, today is a perfect example. And also, as Dr. McCarthy mentioned, the conflicts in communal-based violence in Northern Ireland. We have explored various strategies for enhancing our approaches, from improving coordination between humanitarian and peace-building actors to prioritizing local ownership and inclusive processes. The key now is to turn these into action. Each of us, be we representatives of the academic community, researchers, international non-governmental organizations, international organizations, UN agencies, or ordinary citizens. Each one of us share responsibility of working towards a more peaceful world. Let us leave this webinar here today with a renewed commitment to transform conflict, not just managing it, and to build peace that is truly sustainable, because the individual can make a lot of change, both in our institutions, both in the policy framework, both in the courses that we deliver. One small step, but a giant leap forward for our common humanity. By enhancing humanitarian action and peace building, we can truly create a future where fewer communities suffer the ravages of conflict and more people have the opportunity to live in dignity, security, and prosperity. This is not just an aspiration, ladies and gentlemen. It is an imperative that our shared humanity and the stability of our world requires from each one of us. Thank you so much, and ladies and gentlemen, again, for those of you who've joined us from the different corners of the world, thank you so much for sacrificing an hour of your time to engage with us in this really important must-have conversation. And once more, Dr. Clem McCarthy and the Honorable Martin Kobler, thank you so much to both of you for your insights, for the honesty and the frankness in which we address the conversation. And allow me also to say, on behalf of the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, we certainly look forward to expand in our collaborative partnership with Diplomats Without Borders in the different training and capacity development programs that we're going to be rolling out in 2025. And I certainly look forward to be collaborating with you again. Ladies and gentlemen, all of you, please stay safe. And to our panelists, a big thank you.
Thank you.